It was mid-November of last year when our lead investigator in training, Josh, gave me a call. He told me that he had a place we could check out. His grandfather owns this house, which he calls a hell house. He calls it that because he says it's not just a normal haunting, but it's something demonic. Josh told me that reports would range from his grandfather seeing people in the house disappearing, including his recently deceased wife, who he would see with another man, things moving around in other rooms, shadows darting in and out of doorways, and even one time he sat a cup of coffee on his coffee table, and it actually started to boil on the table. Well, we got the okay to stay the night there. We had no power because Josh's grandfather refused to stay in place, so we had nothing but flashlights. Well, we got to the house at about 11:30 that night, from what Josh's grandfather had told us. He said nothing would happen until 1 a.m., and we found out the hard way that he wasn't kidding. Well, we just goofed off and stuff for a while until the time neared 1 a.m. We could slowly but surely start to see our breath as it got closer to 1 a.m., so we thought that was fairly weird. Josh had brought his laptop, so he stayed in the back room and was messing around with it while Sean and I walked around the house and explored. This was a fairly large house. Sean and I were on the other end, opposite Josh, and next thing we know, Josh is yelling at us, "What are you guys doing in there?" We walked back out into the hallway and replied, "We're just looking around in these rooms." "Are you both back there?" Josh yelled back. "Yeah, man." Sean replied. Next thing I know, Josh is yelling at us to get in there. Well, he told us that in the room next to the room he was in, he heard what sounded like someone knocking on a wall, and he thought it was one of us. Well, that got us excited, so we decided to start investigating. So we go to the living room and we sit down. Sean and Josh sat down on the couch, and I sat down in Josh's grandfather's recliner opposite side of the room. We had all the lights out, so I decided to take a few pictures with my digital camera. So I took a few behind me and down the hallway and stuff. Josh tells me to take a picture of them on the couch because he felt like something was near him. So I moved my camera to where it's looking at them. Sean had an audio recorder, so it had a red light on the end of it, and the camera picked up the red light. Well, up above Josh's head, there were two more red lights. It looked like eyes, as if some kind of animal or something was sitting on the top of the couch directly above his head. I told him about it, and Josh yelled at me to take the picture. So I pressed the button down, and my camera dies. I quickly replaced the batteries, and I looked back through the camera at them. This time there weren't just two red dots above his head. There were several. So I snapped the picture really fast. Everything went dark after the camera flashed. "Dang, that was bright, wasn't it, Josh?" Sean asked. There was no reply. I turned on my flashlight and shined it at him. He had the hood of his jacket pulled down over his face to where you couldn't see his eyes, and he was breathing heavily. I ran over there and stood over him. "Josh, what are you doing, man?" I asked in a worried tone. He started breathing really weird at this point. "What do we do?" Sean asked. So I figured the best thing we could do was pray, because I was positive he was being possessed. "Pray," I yelled as I slammed my hand onto his forehead. Sean joined me, and we started to pray for him. Well, in the middle of my prayer, I suddenly got this sensation, which I can only explain as feeling like someone was pressing a million needles into my head. I prayed until I couldn't stand the feeling anymore, so I let go. "I've got to get thee out of here," I yelled as I grabbed my head. I remember pacing back and forth. "What's wrong?" Sean asked as he kept his hand on Josh's head. My head," I replied. I ran for the door and flung it open. I kind of remember saying, "We need to get his grandfather," but it's all a blur in my head from that point. This is where it gets weird. I remember walking out onto the porch, one step on the porch before Josh said, "It's okay, come here." So I turned right around and walked back inside. Well, when we were talking about the experience after it happened, Sean gave me a grim look, and he said I walked out onto the porch and paced back and forth for a good 5 minutes. I only remember walking out and then walking back in. We got Josh some water, and we asked him what had happened. He told us he closed his eyes to avoid being blinded by the flash of the camera, and when he did, he couldn't open them. Then he told us that he saw his deceased grandmother. standing in front of him in the room with us. And she said, "Josh, honey, you kids need to leave." And then he said once I stood up and started walking towards him, the voice turned deep and more demanding. "Leave now," it yelled. I actually looked at the picture and I zoomed in on Josh and right to his right side, exactly where I'd stepped to start praying for him. There was a very, very distinct orb, stranger from every orb I've ever seen. So I figured this thing was trying to possess my friend, and once I stepped away, part of that started to mess with me, giving me the needles in my head sensation. We thought it was weird that Sean hadn't felt anything weird from it. Well, it turns out when my sister heard we were going to a house with demonic activity, she gave us a few cross necklaces, both of which Sean had in his hands during the whole event. So we walked through the house one last time, and we started saying prayers over each room. We could actually feel the coldness retreating away from us as we said each one. We packed up and left for the night. We're hoping to try and stay again one night. Neither Josh nor I wanted to stay much longer after the incident. When I was younger, I always tried to avoid ghosts as much as possible because I used to watch Scooby-Doo, and it conditioned me to be afraid of them. Green Pond is a very small town surrounded by other small towns. Within a 5-mile radius of where I live, I have heard of 3 haunted houses, which are now torn down. What I know about them are secondhand since I tried to avoid ghosts. The first was a house down the road that nobody has ever lived in since I have been here. According to the story, a man was shot in that house, and blood stains reappear on the floor no matter what you did. The second was a greenhouse 2 or 3 miles away in Woodstock that nobody would live in too long. A lady who used to live that was pregnant and depressed and took her own life. She is the one that haunted it supposedly. The third house was a pink house 5 miles away in Gray Hill that was occupied. I think when I first heard that it was haunted, but was vacant not long after, and sat and deteriorated over a period of 12 to 15 years before it was torn down. There's also a subdivision that had some of the houses built on top of Indian burial grounds, and a few of those houses were haunted, including the one my second wife lived in. Now you could do everything possible to avoid a ghost, but sometimes life will catch you off guard. After my first wife died, I got brave and would visit her grave when I had time, 9:00 at night at a country cemetery, where the closest house was a quarter of a mile away with the only street light. I stood my ground in the name of Jesus and told who was there that I had a right to be there and I would not be run off. Nothing ever bothered me except for one time when I thought I heard a ghost rattling chains. But I went to where the noise was, and it was the rope on the flagpole hitting the side of the pole. Then one night, I was lying in bed and woke up to someone yanking on my arm like they were trying to pull me off the bed. I snatched my arm and said loudly, "Well, just pull me off the bed then." And it let go, and I had no other problems until I married my second wife. My wife lived in a haunted house, and I think she brought some of the ghosts with her, mainly a spirit that took the form of me and would try to seduce her. It also took her form and passed by the bedroom door once. It only tried to seduce her once, and God rebuked it through my wife's voice. It was God versus the spirit that looked like me, and she thought it was me until God spoke to it through her. After this, his head scrambled, and he said loudly and angrily, waving his arms and backing up, "If that's the way it's going to be, just forget it, just forget it." And he was gone. I asked her later if she meant his head blurred, and she said no, it scrambled. She thinks that it tried to choke her in bed years later, but she prayed and it released her. I think that the only problem she had after that was not that particular spirit, but some I brought home from a graveyard one time when me and her were split up. I was lonely and angry and said at my first wife's grave, "Why don't you just come home with me?" I think something did, but I didn't know about it until me and my second wife got back together. She would hear footsteps banging on walls, her bed being kicked every morning, and someone saying "H.I." in a female voice, and my voice calling to her when I didn't call. I got madder than a wet setting hand, because when they upset my wife, I considered that messing with me. I tried calling them out saying, "If you got something to say it. If you want to fight me. If you want to scare somebody, scare me." This was doing it at my convenience, of course, and the bedroom was off limits. I also try to get them to leave going as far as anointing the doors and windows with new olive oil, extra virgin. That was bought and used only for that purpose, and I did this while rebuking out loud. I also went through a ritual where I explained to it slash them to get in. The car. I even opened the door for them. And I would take you back to the cemetery in which I drove to the cemetery and open the door and let them out. Things have quieted down, but I do feel somebody still looking at me every now and then. And my wife is still scared because of past experiences. I try to get her to stay up here and face her fears, even to the point of getting her to listen to my voice on the CB radio talking to my friends while I was night watchman, and she could talk back, but she finally resorted to sleeping at my parents' house 50 yards away. Anyhow, now they slash it mainly picks on other people who come in when we are not home people, who have permission, like a homeless man we knew, and we let him spend the night alone. He didn't go to sleep until my wife and I got home in the morning and wouldn't stay another night. And my wife's cousin and his wife, who heard a lot of activity running, door slamming, and then his wife was pushed when they left out the door. I guess next time I give them permission to come in and cook something, I need to say it inside instead of outside, so the ghost can hear it. All I can say is I sure feel sorry for anybody that breaks into our trailer, because they're going to probably get a surprise. And if I could videotape it, I'll bet that would be entertaining. I still don't trust these spirits, though. God bless. It was the spring of 2001, and quite frankly, I was in a job that I hated at a local community college. My immediate supervisor was a red-faced, shrewish man who watched my every move and fabricated myths about my conduct out of sheer spite. At the time, I could not know that within 5 years a place would crumble and fall amid charges of corruption, nepotism, graft, and vice. No wonder I did not fit in. I was an honest teacher amid vipers. As I pulled into the parking lot that fateful day, I saw a murder of crows poised in the distance around a puddle. I paid them no mind as I entered the building. Something told me to bypass the main office and mailroom that day and just go straight to my cubicle before teaching. But I did anyway. Stupid woman. I'd been pinked. They called it a reduction enforced due to budget cuts. But I knew better. The jackanape in the dean's office was all too happy to invoke the no contest clause in my contract and send me on my way. After all, they could hire a lot more part-timers for the price of me. A full-time employee. Somehow, I managed not to blubber like an idiot throughout the day. At least they, like lily-livered chickens, had waited until a Friday. Guess the reality of unemployment had not set in. Finally, it was time to go to my vehicle. The murder was still outside. It had, however, relocated to my Suburban. The birds perched, cawed, and menaced. Quite honestly, it was some time before I could shoot them from my vehicle, and the odd thing was here was my car, surrounded by a sea of other cars in a large college parking lot, and it was the only one covered in bluish-black, gabby birds. When they finally left, there wasn't a drop of bird feces on it. I don't know why they were there. It wasn't like I had a carrion-covered car. Still, the episode gave me the heebie-jeebies. There was a message in the visit. I knew it, and I despised them. I went home and dealt with a gamut of emotions that goes with losing one's job and a going-away party of crows. That night, I saw what I thought was a shadow of a man in the corner of my room. But I blew it off as my mind playing tricks on me, since I was emotionally overwrought. The long and the short of it is, weeks passed, I became depressed. Went through the motions of surviving my job until it ended and went home. Summer term came, and while at home, I began planning for a new business. Still, tensions ran high. There were financial worries, migraines, lie in bed most of the day. I found an old storefront in a historical district and began to make a career change altogether. The building had once been a dance studio, an auto parts store, a diner. It was old, but had a good vibe. I liked the feel of it. The dilapidated building abutting the structure, though, was another story. It had been a speakeasy, a furniture store, and a funeral home. Within a week of moving into my building, as luck would have it, the building next door was condemned. Local historians, trying to prevent its demolition, went into the basement one day and pulled out some unique caskets from the late 1800s. They were wooden with peculiar angular wooden caskets with little window/doors where the faces of the deceased would be so that people could look at them. in my building and the one next door. I never felt a particular entity, but sometimes I felt a heaviness and occasionally objects would fall from the walls. All the while, I was working very hard, experiencing headaches and experiencing strange sleep patterns. At some point during this period, I began to start seeing the shadow person slash people slash things. At first, it was like a head and a torso that would appear in corners or that would seem to hop down the hall to my bedroom. At first, I thought they were the result of too much migraine medicine, but they would appear on hazy afternoon sans naps in the middle of the night. Seeing this being would always cause me concern, but I always sensed that he was watching me. One night, though, after a shadow man made a hop down the hall, I decided to really concentrate on it. Watch it. That's when it began to do a lot of really odd things. It backed into a wall and broke into spider-like pieces and began crawling around the perimeter of the room. It didn't crawl arm over arm, like a human would prowl, but like one of those rubber toys would when you slap it against a wall and it rolls down in a vertical fashion, only these did so in a horizontal fashion. When these shadowy beings appeared, they were mostly silent. Occasionally there was a sound like air leaking from a tire. Oftentimes my chest felt tight, like I could not speak. I do not know if they followed me from the shop, or if they were psychological manifestations due to my stress, or if they were time travelers, as some people suspect. I have since moved from the shop and the home where these entities appeared. They don't seem to follow me in the 4 years I've been here, but there is this sinking feeling whenever I see crows or a darkened room. I half expect them to make an appearance. I have never seen anything unusual with the naked eye. That is, out of curiosity, I have snapped a few pictures with a phone camera and believed to have captured a couple of orb shots. I began taking pictures after a few unusual events happened. Nothing really spectacular. First one happened when I first bought the house. I had just picked my children up from school and stopped by to pick up supper at local restaurant. We arrived home and we all sat down to eat. All of a sudden, I heard the sound of water gushing, thinking to myself, oh no, the sink has sprung a leak. Running to the kitchen, I noticed the faucet was on full blast, so I turned it off. The children and I were the only ones there around 4 p.m. eating supper. This next experience was to do with an old mantel clock that I keep unwound and not working. One night, while working, I call home to talk to my teenage son. He was up fixing something to eat. All of a sudden the clock chimed. I asked him what he did. At this point he was in full panic, saying the other siblings are in their room asleep, and he was nowhere near the clock and didn't touch it. The next evening I was home and decided to walk around the house with my camera phone. Yeah, I'm not exactly a pro Ghostbuster, and snapped some shots, several of the mantel clock. I set the phone to the 6-shot sequence. In 2 of those shots, there's a red orb slash circle slash aura around the clock. In another picture, not really hunting, I took a picture of my daughter and new puppy, and it looks like an orb in motion flashing past her face. The haunting in my parents' house started when I was 13. I woke up one morning and went to the kitchen to eat breakfast, and my mom was sitting just staring at the kitchen table. I could sense something was bothering her. So we started talking about what we were going to do that day, and eventually she told me what the matter was. She told me that morning she had gotten up early and was washing clothes in the laundry room. At the back of the laundry room was a dryer, and she stood there folding clothes. She said she started feeling sick and could feel someone standing in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn to see who was there but continued folding clothes, and then she heard crying, a child's cry. She turned to look thinking it was me or one of my younger brothers up from a bad dream, but there was no one there, and the crying continued. She said she could look at the exact point the crying was coming from, and it started to move away from her, going in the dining room. She followed the crying, and it continued to move out of the dining room and into the living room. From the living room into the hallway until it faded away. She was left standing there thinking she was going crazy, with the sinking feeling still fresh in her abdomen. I believed her. I was shocked she would tell me such a thing, because my mom was always very level-headed and never talked to such things as spirits or ghosts. From then on, my mother and I and my youngest brother would experience many odder, unexplainable things.